she disappeared from her own living room. No signs of a struggle. No forced entry. Her phone went silent at the exact same moment as her fiancé's. For 13 years, he searched with everyone else. Spoke to the media. Stood beside her family. Until one detail finally exposed him. And what he admitted, still doesn't explain everything. She was sitting on her couch. Laptop balanced on her knees. Summer evening in Ohio. Schoolwork open on the screen in front of her. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday night that people live through thousands of times across a lifetime and never once think to remember, because there is nothing to remember, because nothing happened, because it was just a night. Her dog was somewhere nearby. Her fiancé was in the room. She had not run. She had not fought. She had not screamed. She was just a young woman on a couch in August, working on a deadline, probably thinking about the coffee she was going to make in an hour, probably thinking about the sketchbook on the table, probably thinking about Colorado and what the light looked like out there in the mornings. And sometime after midnight, she was gone. Not missing the way people sometimes go missing, with luggage and a note and a destination someone eventually traces. Gone the way a light goes out. Present and then not. Warm and then not. There and then simply, completely, devastatingly not. Her name was CAITLYN Helen Markham. She was 20 years old. She had paint in her hair on the best days and a laugh that started before the joke was finished and a future that was, by every honest measure, just beginning to open up into the shape it was always supposed to take. And in a townhouse on Dorshire Drive in Fairfield, Ohio, on the night of August 13, 2011, someone took all of that away from her. What follows is not a story that ends with clean justice. It is not a story that ends with a confession, or with a courtroom moment that finally makes everything make sense. What follows is a story about 13 years. About a father who could not stop. About a man who spent more than a decade performing grief he did not feel while standing next to the people who felt it more than they could bear. About a young woman who deserved so much more than what the law was ultimately able to give her. And about the way that some cases refuse, no matter how long they sit in the cold, to stay quiet. This is the full story of Caitlyn Markham. And here on Cold Case, Solved Files, we are going to tell it the way she deserves to have it told. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to say something directly to you. Caitlyn Markham's family spent 13 years fighting to make sure her name was not forgotten. 13 years of searches and vigils and courtrooms and a father who drove roads he had already driven 100 times because he simply could not stop. The very least we can do is make sure her story reaches as many people as possible. If this case matters to you, please hit the like button right now. Leave a comment below and tell us you are here for Caitlyn. And if you have not already subscribed to Cold Case, Solved Files, please do that right now, because every subscriber, every like, every share is how we keep these stories alive and how we make sure that families like the Markhams know that the world has not moved on, even when it felt like it had. Caitlyn deserves an audience. She deserves witnesses. She deserves people who will hear what happened to her and refuse to look away. Now let us go back to the beginning. Fairfield, Ohio does not announce itself dramatically. It settles into you quietly. Humid air that sits on your skin before you have finished stepping outside. The sound of crickets carrying across streets after dark where the houses look nearly identical from the road and the differences between them are all on the inside, hidden behind doors and the particular silences that families keep between themselves. The kind of place people describe as safe without thinking much about what that word actually means or what it costs when it turns out to be wrong. Caitlyn Helen Markham was born in Fairfield on August 16, 1990. And from the very first minutes of her life, she was loved without condition. Her father, Dave, had chosen adoption. When the call came, he drove straight to that hospital and held his daughter for the first time when she was just 20 minutes old. He pressed her against his chest and by his own account he simply could not stop looking at her. That hospital room was its own complete world. Outside of it, the larger world was already shifting in ways no one could see yet. Caitlyn grew up alongside her younger sister Ollie, 4 years her junior. Their parents separated during her childhood, but both remained present and both remained devoted. What strikes you, sitting with the accounts of the people who knew her, is that everyone reaches for the same words and then seems to realize those words are not quite enough. She made people feel seen. She laughed at her own jokes before she had finished telling them. She was, in the most genuine sense, someone you wanted to be near. She had paint in her hair almost constantly. Not as a statement. Simply because she forgot it was there. Because she had been so entirely absorbed in whatever she was creating that by the time she looked up, it was already too late to matter. Her sketchbook lived on every table she ever occupied. Her camera went everywhere she went. If a particular quality of light caught her eye, she needed to capture it before the moment passed. Her high school art teacher said it plainly. This was not a student who was good at art class. This was someone who thought in images. She enrolled at the Art Institute of Ohio in Cincinnati. Graphic design. Commercial arts. She flourished. By the summer of 2011, her sketchbooks were fuller than they had ever been. She had a part-time job at David's Bridal. She had a townhouse on Dorshire Drive. She had a dog she loved without reservation. Everything she had been working toward was almost within reach. John Carter had been part of Caitlyn's life since she was around 16. They found each other through the overlapping social world of mutual friends that makes everyone feel, for a while, like they belonged to the same story. John was a year older, also from Fairfield. He worked with fire and molten glass, shaping objects under intense heat. People who knew them in those early years described them as well-suited. Two eccentric teenagers who seemed to balance each other. By the spring of 2011 they had been together for 6 years. John proposed. The ring was a family heirloom. Dave gave his blessing. As long as his daughter was happy. As long as she was taken care of. And then there was the plan. Colorado after graduation. A fresh start somewhere entirely new. John talked about it constantly. Caitlyn talked about it too. But if you listened carefully, and some people were beginning to, there was something different in the way she said it. A flatness. A hesitation she had not yet entirely learned how to conceal. Because behind the door of that townhouse, things were not what they appeared to be. By June of 2011, Caitlyn had been confiding in a close friend. Carefully. Quietly. About what the relationship had actually become. The controlling behavior. The jealousy that turned sharp whenever she even spoke to another man. The pressure she had grown exhausted by. She told her friend plainly. She no longer loved him. She felt trapped. She had grown far beyond the girl who had walked into this relationship at 16. Colorado was his plan, not hers. She had been putting away money and making the practical arrangements. He had been spending. She had been preparing to leave a relationship. He had been preparing to relocate it. Then came the credit card incident. 3 weeks before she disappeared. Caitlyn went to the GE credit union with John's mother to apply for a card. A routine errand. But at the counter, John's mother made a joke. She would co-sign, she said, but only if Caitlyn promised to take John with her to Colorado. The branch manager laughed and turned to Caitlyn, expecting the same lightness in return. Caitlyn did not laugh. The manager remembered her expression as somber. Serious in a way that felt wrong for the moment. Like someone going through emotion while thinking very clearly about a decision she had not yet said out loud to anyone who needed to hear it. The application was never completed. On the evening of August 13, 2011, a mutual friend came over to the townhouse. The three of them spent the evening together. The friend would later tell investigators that Caitlyn barely moved from the couch the entire time. Laptop on her knees. Schoolwork open. She was quieter than usual. Distant in a way he could not quite name. She did not make her usual jokes. Did not fill the room the way she normally did. He left around 10:45. He said goodbye, stepped outside, and left her there with John. It was the last time he ever saw her. Somewhere between the last text she sent at 11:36 that night and the moment her phone went dark just after midnight, something happened inside that townhouse that would take 13 years to bring into the light. The call came the following day. "Hi, my name is John Carter. I am calling because I know you are not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours, but my fiancé is missing. I cannot find her anywhere." Listen to that call. Not for what he says. For how he says it. The pacing is controlled. The details arrive in the right sequence, neat and almost rehearsed. When the dispatcher asks whether the two of them had argued the night before, the answer comes back instantly. Not at all. No pause. No searching back through the fog of genuine worry and exhaustion. The kind of clean, immediate answer that does not belong to someone reconstructing memory but to someone who already knew that question was coming. The hesitation only appears in the wrong places. On simple factual questions. Things a person should know without thinking. And then, almost as a passing remark, before anyone had thought to ask him where to look, John mentioned the Sacred Heart Festival happening just up the street. Lots of strangers in the area, he said. Questionable people around the neighborhood. He was pointing elsewhere before the search had even begun. Officers arrived at the townhouse and found nothing that looked like a crime scene. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. Caitlyn's purse was on her bed. Her keys beside it. Her wallet, identification, and cash all untouched. Her clothes in the closet. Her shoes by the door. The only things missing were Caitlyn and her phone. And her dog was wandering the yard alone. For anyone who knew her, that last detail landed differently than everything else. She would not have left him like that. It was the clearest signal in that entire carefully arranged scene. Quiet, small, and devastating. Fairfield police followed the festival suggestion and it led precisely nowhere. Every person they looked at seriously, they cleared. The Sacred Heart Festival had nothing to do with any of this. Which brought them back, as it always would, to the last person who had been alone with her. The community response was enormous and immediate. Volunteers came by the hundreds. Wooded areas, parks, waterways, old train tracks, searched and searched again. Dave Markham was at the center of all of it, channeling the unbearable energy of a father who cannot stop moving because stopping means accepting something he was not prepared to accept. A mounted search team came in from Texas. The reward fund grew. The story went national. John Carter was there too. In front of cameras. In the search parties. In every available interview. He called Caitlyn the love of his life. Said he was terrified. Said all he wanted was to take her to Red Lobster for her birthday the way they had planned. He was, by every visible measure, a man consumed by grief. But investigators were watching. And the picture they were assembling did not match the performance they were seeing. Within the first 48 hours, John was brought in for formal questioning. Investigators used a voice stress analyzer. Not evidence. Not a verdict. But a map. It gave them a very clear one. When asked whether he knew anything about Caitlyn's disappearance, deception indicated. When asked whether he was involved, deception indicated again. Consistently, across every question that touched the night of August 13th. And then the investigators noticed his neck. Running along the side of it were angry, jagged marks. Deep red scratches that curved in a way no electric razor produces. When asked, John said it was from shaving. When pressed in a later conversation, the story shifted. He said he was not actually sure how he had gotten them. Could not recall. A friend confirmed he had seen no scratches on John's neck on the evening of August 13th. He first noticed them the following day. The day Caitlyn was reported missing. A friend of Caitlyn's told investigators that in those first days after the disappearance, when she spent time with John, she noticed something she could not set aside. He kept referring to Caitlyn in the past tense. Not once. Repeatedly. Naturally. The way language slips when the truth beneath it is already settled. She had been missing less than 48 hours. Dave Markham had felt it even earlier. From the very first phone call, when John screamed into the receiver that Caitlyn was missing. What Dave noticed was the shape of what was not there. John never asked, "Have you seen her? Did she call you? Is she with you?" He never asked. He announced. From the moment he screamed in my ear, Dave would later say, I did not believe him. When the phone records came back, they turned suspicion into something harder. Texts had passed between Caitlyn and John from 11 that night until 11:36. Then silence. At 12 minutes past midnight, both phones went dark. Not one before the other. Simultaneously. The same moment. Two phones, two people, one coordinated instant of silence. When investigators asked about the deleted texts, John said he had deleted them by accident. Then in a second conversation the story shifted. He had deleted them to free up storage space because he was receiving so many messages from concerned friends. It was 2011. Smartphones did not work that way. The excuse collapsed under the weight of its own logic. And Caitlyn's phone was never found. Not then. Not ever. The town kept searching. The cameras kept rolling. John Carter kept appearing, kept speaking, kept performing the role of the desperate fiancé in a case that publicly had no suspects and no answers. But the map had its roads marked. The scratches had been photographed. Two phones had gone silent at the same moment. And a father who had held his daughter at 20 minutes old already knew, in the way that grief sometimes knows before the evidence catches up, exactly what had happened. The case had nowhere left to go. So it did what cold cases do. It waited. The news cycle moved on. Within weeks the cameras appeared less frequently. The national coverage thinned. Other stories came along. They always do. The weight of attention that had briefly pressed down on this case began to lift. Dave Markham had not moved anywhere. He was still there. In the search parties. At the community meetings. In front of anyone who would listen. He had helped establish a new chapter of Texas EquiSearch. Where others had searched for Caitlyn, Dave now helped search for other people's children, channeling the unbearable energy of a father with nowhere left to put it. John Carter continued appearing on camera. He gave interviews. He participated in vigils. He stood beside Dave at community events and spoke about Caitlyn in careful, measured sentences. There were no tears. Something that people around him began to notice and quietly file away. Tina Barrett, a lawyer who had known the family since 2011, would later say it plainly. She had watched John Carter across years of public appearances. Through all the vigils and searches and memorials. And in all that time, she never once saw him cry. Not until he was afraid. In September of 2011, 1 month after Caitlyn vanished, John Carter sat down for a formal polygraph examination. He did not pass it. Polygraph results are not admissible in court, but they gave investigators a shape. A direction. A sense of where the inconsistencies lived. In John's case, the inconsistencies lived in every question that touched the night of August 13th. By the middle of 2012, a man named Garrett Kong briefly surfaced as a lead. He had been indicted on a sexual battery charge in Oxford, Ohio and lived just blocks from Caitlyn's townhouse. The community latched onto it with the desperate energy of people who needed an answer. Fairfield police investigated thoroughly and then cleared him completely. Dave Markham would later describe running into Kong at the same gas station near Caitlyn Street. Kong saw him, recognized him, and his shoulders dropped. He looked at Dave and said simply, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Dave said it broke his heart. Because it never should have been him. As more people came forward, a portrait of the relationship emerged that contradicted almost everything John had said publicly. Friends described a Caitlyn who had been quietly unhappy for months. Worn down by controlling behavior, by John's drug use, by the pressure he applied in private that he was careful never to display publicly. One friend said Caitlyn had told her plainly in June of 2011 that she no longer loved him. That she felt trapped. That Colorado was his plan, not hers. But distance is not evidence. And evidence was what they did not have. Spring arrived in 2013. Then April. On April 7th, a couple was making their way along the creek banks off Big Cedar Road in Cedar Grove, Indiana, approximately 30 miles east of Fairfield, across the state line. They were searching for scrap metal, familiar with the land. When they came across what appeared to be a pile of discarded debris wrapped in black plastic sheeting, they might have walked past it. They did not. Inside the sheeting, partially exposed, was a jawbone. Franklin County Sheriff's deputies and Indiana State Police responded. What they found spread across the dump site was not buried, not concealed with any particular care, but layered under trash as though simply left there. The skeletal remains of a young woman, 30 miles from the last place anyone had seen her alive. Dental records confirmed it within days. The remains belonged to Caitlyn Markham. She had been missing for 20 months. The forensic examination that followed was careful and, in several of its findings, deeply disturbing. The bones showed no signs of having been buried at this location. The body had been dumped here and possibly moved from somewhere else entirely. The skull had been found separately, inside a tied plastic bag. The medical examiner determined that decomposition had not occurred inside that bag. It had been placed there after significant decomposition had already taken place elsewhere. Meaning someone had returned to wherever Caitlyn's remains had first been left and moved them deliberately. On the bones of her left wrist, forensic anthropologists identified 3 to 4 sharp force wounds. A precise V-shaped incision that had cut into the surface of the bone itself. Not consistent with any accident. Not consistent with any natural process. The coroner ruled the death a homicide. The cause of death could not be determined. When a reporter reached out to John Carter for comment, his response came by text message. He had only ever been in front of cameras because he wanted to find Caitlyn, he said. Now that was done. He had no interest in being on camera anymore. He just wanted to mourn his loss and put his life back together. No rage at whoever had done this. No demand for answers. No mention of justice. Just a desire to move on. Dave Markham read those words and felt something harden in him. He had felt it since the very first phone call. That scream. That announcement. That absence of the questions a genuinely worried person asks. He was not going to let this case sit. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this shocking story. In 2015, Dave lobbied the Butler County Sheriff's Office directly and pushed for the investigation to be transferred away from the Fairfield Police Department, which had run out of runway, and into new hands. The Butler County Sheriff agreed. Fresh investigators came in. Boxes of case files were opened and re-examined from the beginning. A neighbor came forward. On the night of August 13th, she said, she had heard voices from the townhouse. Muffled. Confrontational. And beneath them, one word repeated. No. Again and again. Digital forensics told another part of the story. John Carter's phone showed 15 consecutive hours of complete inactivity beginning in the early morning of August 14th. The exact window during which investigators calculated a body would have needed to be transported 30 miles across a state line and deposited along Big Cedar Road. 15 hours of silence from the phone of a man who publicly claimed to have spent that entire day desperately trying to reach his missing fiancée. In January of 2021, John Carter sat down for his third formal polygraph examination. On the standard scale, 0 indicates no deception. -3 is considered significant. John Carter scored -25. The examiner said it was not even close. That charts do not behave this way for people telling the truth. The questions that produced the most extreme responses were those asking directly whether John had disposed of Caitlyn's body at Big Cedar Road. When investigators raised these results with John's mother, Karen Winkler, she told them that Jeffrey Dahmer had once passed a polygraph. She offered it as though it settled something. The investigator replied quietly that he was not talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was talking about her son. And then he said something directly to John in one of their final interviews that landed in that room and stayed there. "I have interviewed 1,000 people across my career. Homicides. Assaults. Trespasses. Every kind of case you can imagine. I have never in my career interviewed a psychopath. The day you walked out of that room, I turned to my colleague and I said, that was the first one." On March 22, 2023, body camera footage captured the moment John Carter was taken into custody at his place of work. He stepped outside and the officers were waiting. What the camera caught in that first unguarded second, before the performance could reassemble itself, was the face of a man who had spent 12 years certain this moment would never arrive. Not shock. Not indignation. Something closer to the particular collapse of someone watching a structure they built, brick by careful brick, finally give way. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. He said there was no physical evidence. The officer acknowledged there was not much direct physical evidence. But there was, the officer said, a considerable amount of everything else. John asked for a lawyer. There is one more account. Offered later, second-hand. An inmate who had spoken with John while he awaited trial said that John had described in private what happened in that townhouse on the night of August 13, 2011. An argument. Caitlyn on the ground. His hands. The silence that followed. And then not panic, not accident, but a deliberate decision to make it look like something she had done to herself. Whether that account is accurate in every detail, only John Carter knows. But it aligned with uncomfortable precision with the wounds on her wrist, and with 12 years of a man who never once in public asked who had done this to the woman he claimed to love. After his arrest, John Carter posted a bond of $1 million and walked out. He went home. He wore a GPS monitor on his ankle and for more than a year continued living his life while Caitlyn's family prepared for a trial that everyone who had waited this long had decided they were ready for. More than 50 people were subpoenaed by the prosecution. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were prepared. June of 2024 was circled on every calendar that mattered. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, John Carter's defense team contacted the prosecutor's office. They were offering a deal. When asked who had made the first move, the prosecutor confirmed it plainly. The defense came to them. Not the other way around. Those who had been watching John Carter since 2011 understood immediately what that meant. Tina Barrett said it without hesitation. He would not have walked into that courtroom and offered a plea unless he believed he was going to be convicted. He had spent 13 years avoiding accountability. He intended to spend whatever came next doing the same. On a Friday in June of 2024, John Carter stood in a Butler County courtroom and entered a guilty plea to a single count of involuntary manslaughter. An unintentional killing committed during the course of a misdemeanor assault. Not murder. Not the deliberate and calculated act that the evidence, the forensic findings, the polygraph results, the phone records, and 12 years of behavior all pointed toward. A misdemeanor assault gone wrong. That was the legal frame. That was what 13 years of a missing woman, a father who never stopped, and a community that searched in the dark had been reduced to. Dave Markham was sitting in that courtroom when the plea was entered. He said afterward that he was shaking. That John Carter had been given 13 years to say it was an accident, to give Caitlyn's family the one thing they had asked for more than a conviction. An explanation. Instead he waited until 3 weeks before a jury would have heard everything, and then made a deal designed to minimize his exposure. He got 6 more weeks of freedom while he waited for sentencing. 6 more weeks. After 13 years. It does not seem right, Dave said. Because it is not. The sentencing hearing arrived in the summer of 2024. John Carter stood before Judge Dan Hoy and said nothing. His attorneys argued for probation. No prison time at all. For the man whose shed had contained plastic sheeting forensically linked to the material around Caitlyn's remains. Whose polygraph had registered -25. Whose phone had been silent for 15 consecutive hours while a body was moved across a state line. Probation. Judge Hoy rejected it. He stated directly that anything short of the maximum sentence would demean the seriousness of what John Carter had done and the impact it had carried across 13 years. He sentenced John Carter to 36 months in state prison. The maximum permitted under Ohio law for a third-degree felony involuntary manslaughter conviction. 36 months. 3 years. For a woman who had been gone for 13. Dave delivered his victim impact statement. He stood before the judge and before the man who had stood beside him at vigils and asked the court to ensure that John Carter felt even a fraction of what the Markham family had carried. Michelle Feist, Caitlyn's closest friend, spoke too. She said it was good in some way to finally have a legal acknowledgement. But then she paused. Really? What is the truth? We still do not actually know what happened that night. And he is still, in some way, denying it. Because John Carter stood in that courtroom and said nothing. Not a word of explanation. Not a sentence directed at the people who had spent 13 years waiting. When given the opportunity to speak, he chose the same silence he had maintained since the night Caitlyn's phone went dark. He did cry, leaving the courthouse. Tears, finally, after 13 years of vigils and searches and media appearances during which not one person had observed them. Tina Barrett watched him and said what she had been thinking for years. John Carter cries when he is afraid. In 2011, when he was telling his story, he was neither afraid nor sad. He is afraid now. What happened in the hallway outside that courtroom defied expectation even for people who had stopped expecting anything reasonable from him. His attorney stood before reporters and stated that John Carter, notwithstanding the guilty plea, had nothing to offer the Markham family about what had actually happened to Caitlyn. And then he said that John Carter was asking the Markham family to go out and find the real person responsible. The real person. After a guilty plea. After the shed. After -25. After 15 hours of phone silence. After 13 years. Find the real person. Dave Markham was standing a few feet away. John's mother, Karen, was also in that hallway. She looked toward the man whose daughter had been wrapped in plastic from her shed and said that she had always adored Caitlyn. That she had always known they had a wonderful relationship. Dave listened to all of it. That was the most bizarre thing I have ever heard, he said afterward. Those were lies. That was delusional. Some months later, John Carter applied for early release, having served roughly half of his sentence, having been noted as a model inmate. Judge Hoy denied it. John Carter would serve his full sentence. There are charges that were never filed and can never be filed now. Ohio's statute of limitations on tampering with evidence and desecration of a corpse is 6 years. The clock had been running from the night Caitlyn went missing. By the time investigators had enough to act, the window had already closed. The man who moved her body, who placed her head in a separate bag, who drove 30 miles across a state line in the dark with his phone silent for 15 consecutive hours. That conduct will never be prosecuted. There is also the question of a second person. A redacted name in the search warrant affidavit. An individual investigators believe helped dispose of Caitlyn's remains. That person has never been charged. The full truth of what happened in the hours after midnight on August 13, 2011, may never be fully known. John Carter has not offered it. He has not tried. He has offered no explanation, Dave said. Not one. To me, that just tells you everything you need to know about his character. Near Caitlyn's home there is a park. Inside that park there is a tree. People who knew her and people who came to know her story call it Caitlyn's butterfly tree. In the days before sentencing, Dave and Tina Barrett gathered supporters there to write letters to the judge, to channel 13 years of grief and fury into something purposeful. Something Caitlyn herself, who spent her whole life turning what she felt into something she could hold and look at, might have recognized. Butterflies. Because that is what she loved. Because Dave has said that in the worst of the early years, when the weight of not knowing was almost unbearable, a butterfly would sometimes come and circle around him and he would think, there she is. She was bright and vibrant and coming out of her shell, he said. Like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. She was just getting started. Dave Markham and Tina Barrett are now working to pass legislation they call Caitlyn's Law. A change that would extend the statute of limitations in cases where a missing person investigation becomes a homicide investigation. The clock, the law would say, should start when the homicide is confirmed, not when the person disappears. So that the next family cannot be robbed of charges the way this family was. So that the next killer cannot simply wait and let time do the work for him. It would be, as Dave put it, so like Caitlyn. Still helping people even now. Still making something out of what was broken. She would have been an extraordinary woman. Her father knows it. Her sister knows it. The art teacher who recognized her gift before she did knows it. Everyone who ever sat beside her and felt, without quite being able to explain why, like the most seen person in the room. She had paint in her hair and a sketchbook on every table and a future she had earned. And it was taken from her by someone who slept in the same house as the evidence for 12 years and called it nothing. Who stood beside her father at vigils and performed grief while the thing he had done sat in the silence between them. Who walked through 13 years of ordinary days and never once offered the people who loved her the single sentence that was the only thing they actually needed from him. 3 years for all of that. The butterfly tree is still there. Dave still visits it. And somewhere, in whatever form love takes when it outlasts the person it belongs to, when it refuses to become past tense no matter how many years insist otherwise, so is she. CAITLYN Helen Markham. August 16, 1990. Forever. Thank you for watching this full story here on Cold Case, Solved Files. If Caitlyn's story moved you, please subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already. Share this video with someone who needs to know her name. Leave a comment below telling us what part of this case stayed with you, what detail you cannot stop thinking about, what moment in these 13 years hit you the hardest. Every view, every share, and every subscriber helps Cold Case, Solved Files keep telling these stories and keep saying these names. Caitlyn had paint in her hair and a camera in her hand and a life she was building one day at a time. The very least we can do is make sure the world does not forget her.